大家好，今天是2025年3月13日啊。因为在11日，乌克兰同意与俄罗斯停火30天，然后美国将恢复军事支持。那么今天也是美国前往俄罗斯参加乌克兰的停火谈判。我们分别来看一下，先看一下乌克兰同意停火。
The talks lasted into the night and ended with a ceasefire proposal far broader than anyone expected, demanded by the Americans and accepted by the Ukrainians. But agreeing a truce plan with only one side won't stop a war.
Today we made an offer that the Ukrainians have accepted, which is to enter into a ceasefire and into immediate negotiations to end this conflict in a way that's enduring and sustainable and accounts for their interests, their security, their ability to prosper as a nation. Hopefully we'll take this offer now to the Russians, and we hope that they'll say yes to peace. The ball is now in their court.
The Americans said they came to see whether Ukraine was committed to President Trump's plan for peace. His top diplomat was trying to change the tone of the last 2 weeks.
Mr. Rubio, your expectations for the meeting today?
It'll be good, he says, giving me a thumbs up. The Ukrainians gathered, badly needing an end to Mr. Trump's freeze on military support, a move the US said was meant to compel them to the table. And so they came with only the warmest of words.
And we're very open, and we want to have very constructive, deep, friend, partners conversation with our American partners.
And then a glimpse of the highest level meeting since ties between these once inseparable friends descended into acrimony, and the moment to see if a broken alliance could be fixed. Tonight, Mr. Zelensky said he welcomed the US truce plan.
The American side understands our arguments, perceives our proposals, and I want to thank President Trump for the constructive conversation between our teams.
No, in this entire meeting, have you said thank you?
That's a thank you the Trump team had angrily demanded in the Oval Office, even though the Ukrainian leader has expressed thanks to the US dozens of times. But the reprieve for this relationship is critical to his country. He was in Saudi Arabia, but not at the talks, in which the US has announced it will immediately reinstate its weapons supply and intelligence sharing with Ukraine.
Ukraine, ceasefire. Ukraine, ceasefire. Just agreed to a little while ago. Now we have to go to Russia and hopefully President Putin will agree to that also, and we can get this show on the road.
The talks at this table lasted more than 8 hours. This is where they arrived at the proposal for an immediate ceasefire. But many in Europe have been deeply concerned about that, about the idea of moving to a quick truce without first negotiating the mechanism to enforce it.
The talks here have grabbed the focus, even as the 3-year war they seek to end intensifies. Mr. Trump's officials will take his plan next to Moscow, a president who wants an immediate ceasefire, but on whose terms? Tom Bateman, BBC News, Jeddah.
Well, President... It's hard to imagine based on the messaging.
The best possible outcome is, of course, total capitulation of Ukraine and Europe. We have to finish this war one way or another. And I hope that what was left of Ukraine would be totally demilitarized and neutralized and live in peace and not used as a spearhead against Russia.
With these drone attacks, Ukraine's message to Russia.
很好，现在乌克兰同意回到这个谈判桌上停火了，然后看一下这个美国访问普京，看看有什么进展没有。我们一起来看一下。
President Trump says that US officials are on their way to Russia to discuss proposals backed by Ukraine for a 30-day ceasefire. The Kremlin released this video of President Putin, which it said was him visiting the Russian border region of Kursk for the first time since Ukraine seized territory there last summer. He expressed hope that the region would soon be, in his words, completely liberated. Officials say that he'd been told the operation to drive Ukrainian forces from the region is in its final stages. Well, the White House has confirmed that President Trump's top mediator, Steve Witkoff, is is heading to Moscow this week for discussions. Mr. Trump's spokeswoman said that we urge the Russians to sign on to this plan. This is the closest we have been to peace in this war. Well, all this comes after Ukraine agreed to a 30-day peace proposal, ceasefire deal proposed by the US during talks this week in Saudi Arabia. Mr. Trump says that the ball is now in Russia's court, indicating that he's heard positive messages from the Russian president. His top diplomat, Marco Rubio, said it would be unfortunate if Moscow rejected the proposal. Now, we're going to hear from Mr. Rubio in just a moment. But first, Britain's Defence Secretary John Healey has urged President Putin to accept the ceasefire proposal.
And I say to President Putin, over to you now. You said you want to talk, prove it.
英国的
Accept the
国防部
ceasefire,
长
start negotiations and end the war. And make no mistake, the pressure is now on Putin.
We all eagerly await the Russian response and urge them strongly to consider ending all hostilities so people will stop
这是美国
dying,
的
so bullets will stop flying, and so a process can begin to find a permanent peace. And we'll see what the response is. If their response is yes, then we know we've made real progress and there's a real chance of peace. If their response is no, it would be highly unfortunate and it would make their intentions clear.
Well, Marco Rubio is to hold talks with G7 foreign ministers in Canada. Our State Department correspondent Tom Bateman is travelling with him. He sent us this update.
Well, we got a few things clarified by the Secretary of State as he spoke to us on the way here to Canada. I think the first was really about the next steps in this joint now American and Ukrainian call for an immediate ceasefire and about contacts with the Russians. You know, they said the ball is now in the Russians' court. He said that there was due to be contact with Moscow today. Now, he wouldn't clarify exactly what or at what level that would take place. But it also gave us a sense, I think, of the urgency with which the Trump administration wants to do all of this. He said this was about how they wanted the world to look within days in terms of using diplomacy. Now, I think that will enhance some of the sense of criticism there's been around this, the idea of trying to rush a truce will embolden the invading power. But the Americans say this is about using diplomacy rather than fighting. And I asked Mr. Rubio about what is a pretty lukewarm reference in the joint statement to the role of the Europeans in this process as he meets G7 foreign ministers here. And I asked about European peacekeepers. Now, he wouldn't commit on that, saying instead that there were a number of different options for creating deterrence on the ground.
Tom Bateman there, just a line coming from the AFP news agency, which is quoting the Kremlin saying that US negotiators are flying to Russia for Ukraine talks. So our understanding is this is the Kremlin saying that US negotiators are flying to Russia for Ukraine talks. A lot to discuss. Let's cross over live to Kyiv because our diplomatic correspondent James Landale joins us. James, good to see you. So a lot of different angles coming together today, but just bring us up to date where we are with this potential ceasefire proposal.
Well, it's very straightforward, really. We know that the Ukrainians have agreed to this US proposal for a month-long interim immediate ceasefire. They have signed up to that in principle. So now, to quote the Americans, the ball is in the court of the Russians to see what response we get from them. And thus far, we have had very, very little indeed. And that, I think, is an indication that the Russians, as ever, want to play this carefully and they want to buy some time. So there's been an awful lot of contact between the US and the Russians in recent days, lots of calls between, the National Security Mike Waltz and his Russian counterpart, the CIA director and his Russian counterpart. We know that Steve Witkoff, the US presidential envoy, is bound for Russia. We're expecting him there fairly soon. So there's been a lot of contact. We know that the Americans have a pretty good idea of where the Russians are on this, not least because, remember, this whole process began with a conversation between Mr. Putin and Mr. Trump that lasted an hour and a half. And there were subsequently those talks between the Russians and the American senior officials in Riyadh, in Saudi Arabia, about two and a half weeks ago. So the Americans have a vague idea of where the Russians are on this, but publicly the Russians at the moment are refusing to say anything, and everybody is basically waiting to see what their response is and what if anything, they demand as a concession before they agree to any kind of temporary ceasefire. Because agreeing a ceasefire, a temporary one, would essentially breach a sort of fundamental Russian negotiating position down the ages, which is this, that nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. And so I think the expectation is that even if the Russians indicate some kind of sympathy towards agreeing a short-term ceasefire, there will be an awful lot of strings attached.
So do we have an indication of what potentially some of those Russian demands are, or is that all being done in a closed process? Do we have an inkling of that?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Russians have been pretty clear about it. On one level, they've said, look, they are not going to accept any kind of European/NATO reassurance forces in Ukraine after any kind of ceasefire. They've also made it very clear that they want Ukraine to be very clear about reneging on its ambition of joining NATO. I think it's very likely that they will demand the lifting of Western sanctions on Russia before there's any kind of movement by them. I think the interesting question is, do the Russians broaden their demands out from just Ukraine-specific demands to their broader security demands? In recent days, Russian ministers and spokesmen and women have been talking a lot about addressing what they call the root causes of the conflict. Now, that is their code for Russia's belief that it was a security encroachment by NATO forces coming closer to Russian territory that provoked them into launching what they call their military operation here in Ukraine. Now, that analysis is dismissed as ludicrous by the West. But the question is, will the Russians say, we'll act on some kind of short-term ceasefire, but we've got to have a discussion about the presence of US forces in parts of Europe, and we've got to make sure that NATO steps back from countries like Poland and the Baltic states. So that's the interesting question. Do they broaden their demands out from Ukraine to their broader security issues?
James, as always, really good to get your analysis there. James Landale joining us live from Kyiv. Thank you very much. A number of different angles and a number of different meetings taking place throughout today when it comes to the geopolitics of this. But just to remind you, that line that is coming from the Kremlin, reported by the AFP news agency, that US negotiators are indeed flying to Russia for those talks on Ukraine. The Kremlin spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, just confirming that negotiators are en route to Russia now and contacts are planned, but no confirmation whether Russia has handed the US a list of demands for Ukraine deal. But arguably, as James was saying there, we know some of the demands that Russia has, and Ukraine joining NATO absolutely off the list. So yeah, Peskov just saying that US negotiators are en route, and it's true that contacts are planned, but Dmitry Peskov saying, let's not get ahead of ourselves. We'll tell you about them later. Contact has already happened. There was, of course, that phone call conversation between the Mike Waltz, who's the US National Security Advisor, and the Russian presidential advisor, Yuri Ushakov. Certain information has been provided to Russia. So lots of different lines coming out ahead of those talks with US negotiators in Moscow. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, joins us live now. And Lise, as always, it's good to see you on a day where lots of different lines are developing. When it comes to our audience, I wonder if you just help us to understand what is the key points that we are looking out for, because we've got the Polish president said that Poland should have some form of nuclear arms. We've got the G7 summit. Of course, we've got the US negotiators on their way to the Kremlin. What is your main takeaway of what we are focusing on today?
Good morning, Kesha. It's always good to speak with you. And you're right to point out people are getting overwhelmed by just how much is happening. Flooding the zone is how they describe it in the United States. And of course, we're just focusing on foreign policy. There are broader strategic issues, some would say even a crisis at play, a reordering of the relationship between the United States and its allies. Some days it seems to be completely shattered. Some days it seems to be possible to rescue in some way. It all depends on what President Trump says and does that day, whether it comes to tariffs or security arrangements. But I think what we have to keep an eye on, because it really is the heart of the issue right now when it comes to what has always been called the transatlantic partnership, that of course is enshrined in the NATO military alliance. It all depends on what happens in Ukraine. And that confirmation that you just read from Moscow, that a delegation is now on its way to Moscow. You heard also in this program already from Secretary of State Marco Rubio. They want this 30-day ceasefire that was agreed in Jeddah between the Americans and the Ukrainians to be agreed by Russia. But as you yourself have been seeing, Kesha, there's no indication yet exactly what President Putin wants to do. All we've seen from him is this quite unexpected image of President Putin in military fatigues for the first time since the war, perhaps taking a leaf out of President Zelensky's book and appearing in the embattled region of Kursk, where it does seem from all reports that the Russians, backed up by North Korean forces, by drones, are pushing the Ukrainians out, which is a real setback for the Ukrainians if peace talks, well, let's not call them peace talks, if talks of some kind are now on the agenda.
And that's absolutely critical, because that would have, that holding of that Kursk region within Russian territory by Ukraine would have given Ukraine a strengthened hand in any form of negotiations. But really important for you just to explain there that we're talking about a possible ceasefire. We're not close to any peace talks yet. It would be good if you just differentiate that for us, Lise, with your expertise.
Well, viewers may have heard President Trump last night saying he really hopes that now that the Ukrainians have accepted it, that the Russians will now accept it. He said, if we get that agreed, we are 80% there. 80%. They are nowhere near 80%. Possibly 5% would be an optimistic for the Ukrainians. Well, in the first place, President Putin has always said he doesn't want a ceasefire, and a ceasefire is not enough. And especially for Ukraine, a ceasefire is not enough. First of all, how can you have a ceasefire agreed for days? There will be the very difficult negotiations on how the ceasefire is monitored. How is Ukraine protected during this time? What happens if either side violates the ceasefire? And the overarching for, you could call it a question, but for Ukraine, it is an existential worry. Ukraine's great deep fear is that for Russia, this is just a tactical pause, a pause as it often happens in war for, it would have to be said, both sides to regroup, to refresh, to rethink, and then go back to the battlefield. But there has been absolutely no indication of any change at all in President Putin's worldview, which is that he doesn't believe Ukraine is a country. He doesn't believe it has a right to exist. And he basically has never gone back from his saying that he basically wants all of Ukraine. And if he doesn't have it territorially, he wants to have a government in Kyiv which will bend to his will.
Lise, as always, really good to get your clarity and your analysis of the bigger picture of this. Thank you so much. Our international correspondent, editor, Lise Doucette there, joining us live. Thank you so much. Numerous different lives. Just Dmitry Peskov, Kremlin spokesperson, saying about Zelensky's remarks that Ukraine will not accept the annexation of any territory by Russia, exactly to what Lise was just mentioning there. Dmitry Peskov saying that Crimea, Sevastopol, Kherson, Zaporizhia, Donetsk and Luhansk are Russian regions. They're in the Russian constitution. It's a fact. So, as Lise was saying, we are nowhere near a peace deal. We are talking about a potential ceasefire, but there's still an awful lot at stake.
所以现在只是说我们回到了谈判桌上啊，有机会回到谈判桌上，只是万里长征的第一步是吧？他们不是很乐观，觉得才完成了5%。川普说，如果乌克兰同意暂时停火，然后俄罗斯也同意暂时停火，都能回到谈判桌上，就已经推进了这个和平谈判的80%啊。 但是现在也只是乌克兰才同意暂时停火30天，所以就是刚才评论员只认为，也就推进了5%吧。俄罗斯这边担心它可能会有更多的，不只是对于乌克兰安全的问题的要求，会有更多的。我们还是希望能够和平解决吧。好，今天到这里，谢谢大家。